What about the future of land acquisition? Well, I think we're all very much aware of the Florida Land and Water Legacy Amendment that will be on the ballot in November. Seeing that the governor and the legislature no longer had a strong commitment to public acquisition of environmentally sensitive lands, citizens went the referendum route, collected the necessary number of signatures to get on to the ballot for the November election, this legacy amendment. And it would require that 33 1/3% of all documentary stamp tax revenues each year would be appropriated for the purpose or enhancement of environmentally endangered lands and water resources in a variety of ways. Now, it's important to note that the documentary stamp tax funds have continued to be collected. The only problem is that the legislature has started to sweep those appropriations and to use that money for other purposes. And the obvious purpose of having a constitutional amendment is to bypass the legislature and the governor and write into our Constitution a requirement that we continue these programs with that level of funding. And I say, as I'm sure most of you know, it will be on the ballot in November. I don't think the voters of Florida have ever turned down a single proposal to spend more money to acquire environmentally sensitive lands. We can all hope that we don't have the first rejection in November. And we all have an interest in making sure that that amendment is passed. The election will also be important for another reason. Are we going to have 4 more years of the approach that we've gotten under the current administration to growth management and planning? Or are we going to see a return to the 40-year legacy that was developed by both Republicans and Democrats as I've described it? The outcome of the gubernatorial election in November is equally important as the Florida Land and Water Legacy Amendment. If we keep going down the road that's been mapped out for the last few years, we may reach the tipping point in Florida where it will be too late to ever recover from the damage that will be done. It's very encouraging to see all of the attention that's now being given to Florida Springs. That is a disgraceful situation that never should have occurred. Back during the time when we had broad bipartisan support for these kinds of environmental measures, the legislature actually appropriated money to both the Department of Community Affairs and the Department of Environmental Protection to create a springs protection program. That money was used to develop model spring protection ordinances and to allow DCA staff and DEP staff to work closely with local governments in which these springs were located to provide protections for them. And finally, a couple of years ago, Senator Lee Constantine, who had worked diligently on this issue for several years, was able to get into legislation that passed strong restrictions on the use of septic tanks, something that's badly needed, especially with regard to our springs. For example, in Wakulla County, where Wakulla Springs are located, we now have my home city, Tallahassee, admitting that its spray fields have led to the pollution in Wakulla Springs, and the city of Tallahassee now has committed itself to spend millions of dollars to correct that situation. But what happened to those more stringent septic tank requirements? Well, people began to yell, the development industry complained, and in 2011, the legislature jerked out all of those provisions so that we're back where we were before with regard to septic tanks. The prospect of getting through this legislature effective springs protection legislation, septic tank legislation, is very problematic, although there's some members of the legislature hard at work trying to come up with a different result this time. but it was very discouraging to see just this past week that 20 different organizations, including, of all things, the Florida League of Cities, wrote a letter strongly opposing the springs protection legislation that's being drafted by 5 members of the Senate. It's the same lineup that torpedoed the Growth Management Act in 2011. And I want to sort of wind up on that because I think none of us should forget or forgive what happened in 2011. Instead of a broad, inclusive, participatory effort to evaluate our growth management laws, streamline where needed, making corrections where needed, but keeping in place the fundamental framework, the legislature turned over to the development industry and its lobbyist in Tallahassee, that is the Florida Chamber of Commerce, Associated Industries, the Association of Florida Community Developers, and the Florida Home Builders, gave them the power and the leeway to draft this legislation. And they took full advantage of it. They struck from the law all of their pet peeves. We don't need concurrency anymore. Let's not require local governments to abide by that anymore. The same thing would have happened if we had turned over solely to the environmental community to draft the laws, or to local governments, or any other group. That's why it has always been important to have a balanced, inclusive, participatory approach to these fundamental laws. And instead, without regard for 40 years of history, without regard to the long-established precedent of using ELMS-type committees to review and revise our laws, the legislature simply said to the development industry lobbyists, have at it. And they had at it, and they produced this piece of legislation, which the governor signed into law without comment. Without comment. It wasn't important enough to even explain why we're taking this action after 40 years of successful history with this program. I suspect that we will continue to see that kind of governance going forward unless changes occur in our government as a result of the November elections. I hate to be pessimistic. In fact, that word future is in the title of my presentation to give a hint, anyway, of optimism, to suggest that there still is a future. There's still a future for these programs and for Florida and its resources if we get out and work hard enough to make a difference. Elections do matter. They have consequences. We're now seeing that all around us. We get another opportunity to revisit this in November. I hope that we all take the opportunity to do it. It would be a shame to have that 40-year history in our state go completely down the drain, never to return again, or when it does, it's too late after too much damage has been done.